Call to order this meeting of the Growth and Natural Resources Committee. We have 3 items that we are hoping to get through today, all by 5 o'clock. So I'm hoping that we can get good but concise reports from staff, have good but concise discussions at the table, and our intent is to get through all 3 of these items, but if need be, we'll hold the last one until our next meeting. That being said, I think we're starting off with Brentwood Estate Sewer Improvements Project.
So we have Eileen and Navarette from Raleigh Water.
Thank you. So a brief agenda of what we're going to talk about this afternoon. Got a brief project overview and project drivers. We'll talk about the project alignment and some of the concerns that have come up over the last several months. Give you a project update and some alternatives for the committee to consider moving forward, and then we'll talk about potential next steps. So in the interest of time, I wanted to start just by providing you with a very brief refresher on the project, since it's been several months since we last discussed it. The project involves the replacement of approximately 6,200 linear feet of 10 to 18-inch sanitary sewer pipe with 18 to 24-inch sanitary sewer pipe. The project limits are represented by the red line on the map. You'll note that New Hope Church Road is to the north of the project, Capitol Boulevard is to the east, and just off the map to the south would be 440. Primary driver for the project is wet weather flow. There have been sanitary sewer overflows in this area, which are represented by yellow dots on the map that's shown on this slide. As a result of the SSOs, the area has been designated as a maintenance hotspot by Raleigh Water's Sewer Maintenance Division.
Could you illustrate where the sewer line in question is in relationship to those sanitary sewer overflows?
Yes, of course. So the sewer line in question is represented by roughly this line that I didn't draw exactly on the alignment.
Right, but the section that we're talking about along Ingram Road is essentially north of the sanitary sewer overflows. Is that correct?
It's in here. It's in an area that was identified in a study as a bottleneck in the system.
Okay.
So the project was first identified in the 2014 sanitary sewer capacity study, and further study was completed on this specific area, which included temporary flow monitoring following the sanitary sewer capacity study. There is additional background. If the committee would like to discuss it, we've got those slides in the bullpen, but in the interest of time, I wasn't going to get into that unless there's questions.
What background are you referring to?
It's the same information that we provided in April about the follow-up study and the temporary flow monitoring.
Okay.
It was more for the folks who may not have been aware of the project previously. So talking about the alignment, at the conclusion of the preliminary engineering phase of the project, which is where we would determine pipe alignments, we selected an alignment for this project. This particular project, the chosen alternative was replacing the existing pipe in the same trench as the existing pipe is located. And we make those decisions for all of our projects based on a number of factors. So we look at rock removal, cost of individual alignments, utilizing city easements versus acquiring new easements, environmental regulations that we have to follow, and something that we deal with particularly in developed areas of our service area are just dealing with limited alternatives. It's not often that we work in big empty areas where we have a lot of easy alternatives. These projects are inherently impactful, and usually we're looking at alternatives that are all challenging. So the selected alternative is what you see on the map, and the area that we're going to focus on for the rest of the presentation is in roughly this area that's been circled. In April of last year, Raleigh Water staff came before City Council to respond to a citizen petition regarding the chosen pipeline route for this project. In the petition, the citizen requested an alternate pipeline route be used near her properties. The red line on the map indicates the alignment proposed by the citizen, and the green is the approximate location of the existing pipe. At that April meeting, City Council directed staff to delineate the wetlands along the project corridor. Progress update. Since we last discussed this project with the City Council, we've had our subconsultant delineate the wetlands along this part of the project corridor. The map that's on the slide is the wetland delineation that was completed. The general area that we're focused is, again, right in here, sort of trying to zoom in for everyone's benefit. A request for jurisdictional determination was submitted to the Corps of Engineers in June. The Corps of Engineers visited the site on August 21st of last year, and this field visit is a normal part of the jurisdictional determination process. On October 8th, staff received an email from the Corps, which was included as part of the backup for this meeting, that the Corps declined to issue a jurisdictional determination at the request of the property owner from the former lake bed. In that email, which we provided as backup, the Corps also reiterated their position that they were unlikely to permit a project with unnecessary wetland impacts.
Yeah, I have some questions about that email.
Can we have the full presentation and then we'll get to questions? Is that okay?
That'd be fine.
Great, thank you.
So based on all the information we gathered, staff requested our consultant to evaluate potential alternatives to the current proposed alignment without impacting adjacent wetlands. Alternative one, which we're providing, is what we call the do-nothing option. The project would be canceled, and council could opt to reallocate the funds elsewhere. The pro to this alternative, of course, is there would be no disturbance to the neighborhood other than eventual clearing of the existing easements that the city already owns. There are several cons to this alternative. Terminating this project would likely result in additional sanitary sewer overflows, which would violate our state and federal permits. It would also set a precedent that regulatory-driven impacts will not be completed as necessary due to private property impacts. Finally, this alternative would require that we continue additional maintenance on this line, i.e., it would continue to be a hotspot for the sewer maintenance division. And this would divert crews from completing other work in the system. Alternative two would be to proceed forward with the current design. This alternative will prevent sanitary sewer overflows. It also provides for equitable treatment of impacted property owners based on the needs of the system. It takes advantage of existing city-owned easements. It also means that fences on these properties can still be located on back property lines. And it's less likely that blasting will be required, or less blasting will be required due to us being able to reuse the existing trench in most locations. The cons to this alternative, that there are additional property impacts because of the size and depth of the new pipe. The city is not able to install the pipe just within the existing 20-foot easement. Additional easement will have to be acquired, which means there will be additional tree removal. And this pipe is closer to the existing homes than it would be on some of the other alternative routes that we'll discuss. So bear with me here. Just to get you oriented, north is to the right on this map, and this is zoomed in on the specific properties that were brought up during this citizen's petition. Your brown line, which is up here, is the proposed alignment with the current design. Excuse me, that's your existing alignment. This other line I'm drawing here is where the line is proposed to be installed. In this location, you'll see that generally the plan is to reuse the same trench that was used for the original pipe. It is a little bit different. We had to make a few adjustments. There is an outbuilding that was constructed at some point partially in the city's existing sewer easement, so we had to make an adjustment of alignment there, but the general plan is to install in the same trench. This purple area is the area that is expected to be cleared for the project.
Does that represent easement, a permanent easement?
The purple area represents your temporary and permanent. So it was everything that would have to be cleared for the project. However, your area that is inside the temporary easement but outside the permanent easement would be allowed to revegetate. So let me see if I can illustrate that for you with a block. So generally speaking, this area, excuse my crude drawing here, this area would be allowed to revegetate.
Mm-hmm.
And then excuse me. This doesn't seem to want to. The same area on the edge of the easement closer to the properties would also be allowed to revegetate.
So how does the current easement compare to the future easement?
The current easement is 20
Wait,
feet.
can you draw it? It's in order to.
Yes, let me see if I can get this to. There we go. So hold on. Your current easement is roughly 20 feet. And at the time this pipe was constructed, that was the standard easement.
Mm-hmm.
This line here is new permanent easement. And then everything outside those red lines is temporary easement. So generally speaking, depending on the depth, depending on the property, the new easement is 40 feet wide. In certain locations across the project, it is 50 feet wide, and that's a function of the depth of the pipe. We have to acquire an easement large enough for us to not only construct the pipe, but also to maintain it and potentially dig it up to repair it, all within the property that we've acquired.
Quick question. Chair. Hey, Eileen. Good to see you again. Eileen, I have the pleasure of working on another sewer project together, me being the resident and her being staff. So similar to other projects, the revegetation that you allow, but it can be taken out in the future by the city, right? The easement still exists in terms of if there's a need to do something else, that vegetation may have to be taken out. Correct?
Yes and no. So on the temporary construction easement, once the project is complete, it's essentially the city is renting the use of that property. So once the project is complete, that portion of the property reverts back entirely to the property owner, and the city doesn't have any rights to it. In a permanent easement, there are rules about what can be replanted in it and how fences can be installed in it. So we generally do allow shallow-rooted bushes to be planted in permanent easement, but the city does reserve the right to clear them should access be necessary to the pipe. So we wouldn't allow retaining walls, parallel fences, trees in permanent easements.
Gotcha. Thank you. One quick question. This may be somewhere in the presentation, but how old is the existing line? Or when
I think it was installed in the 60s.
60s. Okay. Thank you.
For quick reference for both members of the committee and for the community and anybody watching at home, in board docs, this presentation is the third PDF that's attached to the item, and some of the lines that are difficult to see here that Eileen has helped to try to magnify, you can see a bit better in your packet.
The thick yellow line that I just put on top of the map indicates the locations where, based on this alternative, where fences could potentially be located on these properties based on the city's rules for easements. So basically, the proposed easements don't impact the fences. Okay, let's talk about alternative 3, which would be a new alignment, and we'll have a map for this one as well. So there's 2 of them, that's why this one is called 3A. I'll describe the pros and cons of each and then share the same type of map for each alternative that we shared on alternative 2 to help you all understand the differences. The pros of this particular rerouting are that it'll prevent SSOs from occurring. Fewer trees will likely be removed from certain properties, but significant clearing will still be required. The alignment is generally consistent with industry best practices, minimizing pipe bends and manholes. And finally, portions of the sewer with this alignment are more shallow than the current design. There are also several drawbacks to this alternative. There are increased negative impacts to properties adjacent to 3824 and 3828 Ingram, and the location of the wetlands mean our standard easement widths cannot be used. Additional stream buffer permitting would be required because there would be additional impacts to the Zone 2 portion of the buffer. We would also have to renegotiate the easement at 3820 Ingram Drive because it's already been settled based on the current design. Additional clearing will also be required to relocate the sewer services on certain properties, which I'll point out in more detail when we get to the map. Finally, this alternative isn't equitable with other Raleigh water projects. If we increase the impacts on some properties to alleviate impacts or remove a pipe from another property or properties, we would be setting a precedent that's very different from how we treat property owners on other projects throughout the service area. So here's your map showing alternative A. So again, the brown-orange line closer to the top of the map is going to be your existing alignment. Alternative 3A takes it down here, back behind this outbuilding, and back up. The purple area again shows your clearing limits, and everything inside the blue dashed lines that you see, that's your permanent easement. So everything inside those lines would not be allowed to grow back as with trees. These areas here, 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 and here, this is work that would have to be done to relocate existing services because the services come out of the homes and are go into a sewer line that's closer to the home. We obviously have to run the sewer line from the existing location of the existing line into the new alignment. Doing that, we've got to clear generally for a shallow service that's less than 5 feet deep, we have to clear about 15 feet to get that pipe in. If the service is deeper than 5 feet, then we need to clear about 20 feet. So those areas, you see, they would be cleared as well. The other thing I want to point out here is that most of this easement is 40 feet wide, and in this location, to avoid the wetlands, which are shown in a shaded green area, we would have to neck the easement down to 30 feet, which is smaller than our standard easement for an 18-inch pipe. The other important item to discuss here relates to fences. So this is the location based on the current alignment where we could place fences. Based on the city standards for fences and easements, the yellow line represents where fences would need to be located with this alignment. So there are a few properties where there would be significant impacts to a 3828. There would be a Ingram. This distance here is about 50 feet. So alternative 3B, this is a variation of 3A. Pros are similar to 3A. Though alternative 3B does impact fewer properties than alternative 3B does impact fewer properties than 3A. The cons are also similar with a few exceptions. This alignment has more manholes and bends in the pipe than we would generally utilize in a design in this location. The impacts to adjacent properties, although fewer properties are impacted, the impacts are more severe to the adjacent properties. The city still can't utilize standard easement widths, and the additional bends and smaller easement will create more challenging access for maintenance purposes. Like 3A, the impacts are not equitable to how we treat property owners on other projects. So here's the map that shows alternative 3B. So again, your existing alignment, this is your 3B alignment. You see juts down only impacts directly 3 property owners. The easement next down here, purple area is again your cleared area. You have these same locations that require, additional clearing, again, to reroute services into the new alignment. Then here's your fence locations with alternative 2. Here's your fence locations based on the city standards for alternative 3B. Alternative 4 would remove the sewer line from nearly all the residential properties along Ingram Drive into the former lake bed. So the pro here, obviously, is we would have fewer impacts to fewer residential property owners. However, the cons here are pretty significant. It's unlikely that the extensive wetland impacts would be permitted, especially given the Corps standards of utilizing the least environmentally damaging practical alternative for this type of infrastructure. If the impacts were permitted, mitigation would be required. In addition, this area contains poor soil conditions for installing flexible pipes, which makes installation more challenging and increases the likelihood of infrastructure failure or premature infrastructure failure. The location would also create maintenance and access challenges because it's low and wet. It doesn't utilize the city's existing easements. And finally, clearing would still be required on private property for service installation, because now we would have to clear those areas from the existing pipe all the way to the backs of the property lines to install those services, so 15 to 20 feet of clearing in that location. Staff's recommendation is to proceed with alternative 2, utilizing the current design that adheres to the city's design standards. Next steps after today, we would notify the property owners of whatever direction we're given by the council. We would continue to negotiate easement acquisition and complete the final design, and we would advertise the project for construction. I'm happy to take any questions.
Council members have any questions?
Yes. Regarding jurisdictional determination, so you referenced an email from Roscoe Sullivan of the Army Corps of Engineer on October 8th. And he indicated in his email that they did not have the permission of the property owner to issue a jurisdictional determination. Is that correct?
That's our understanding.
Okay. Are there any other triggers for a jurisdictional determination other than the property owner requesting it? For example, if we were to propose to the Army Corps of Engineer that we wanted to do this project, would that trigger a jurisdictional determination?
We would have to get impacts permitted through the Corps of Engineers. That's utilizing Section 404 of the Clean Water Act.
Well, it's not just a question of evaluating the project against Section 4, but also to get a jurisdictional determination to determine where the wetland is. So if we were to propose a project that actually had impacts to the existing, what has been already determined as a wetland, would that request trigger a jurisdictional determination?
The Corps has indicated to us, and this is what went on last fall, Aaron, feel free if I missed something here since he had the interaction with the Corps, is that they'll generally, when we submit a permit application, they'll generally go by our maps. But previously, we've requested for our projects a jurisdictional determination from the Corps for any impacts to wetlands that we have for our projects.
But have we done that here where we've actually told them that we want to do this project and there will be impacts, and therefore they would come forward with a jurisdictional determination based on the study that we did?
For these particular properties, no. There has been interaction with the Corps regarding perpendicular wetland crossings on this project, but not for a longitudinal impact.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to determine is, aside from the property owner, and the property owner is here in the audience, aside from him requesting a jurisdictional determination, we have actually not formally requested a jurisdictional determination from the Corps. We've not submitted to them any documentation about a project and proposed impacts. that would trigger a jurisdictional determination. Is that correct?
We did request a jurisdictional determination, but not because of that we were planning to impact those wetlands.
Okay, and if we were to contact them and inform them that we were going to impact, that we had plans to impact this area, would that trigger a jurisdictional determination?
They would use our consultant's mapping.
They would, and then they would issue a jurisdictional determination.
That's my understanding.
Okay. So one of the things that's really hampering us from considering moving the pipe is that we don't have the jurisdictional determination today. But it does sound like that there is an avenue to get that jurisdictional determination if we wanted to.
I would not say that that's the roadblock. The roadblock would be that staff doesn't intend, based on conversations with the Corps, we don't believe we can get the impacts permitted. And we go to pretty significant
I'm not
lengths.
asking about getting the impacts permitted. I'm asking about getting the jurisdictional determination. I think there are two steps. There's the jurisdictional determination, and then there's getting the permits.
Before staff answers, I feel like we're going somewhere where the rest of council isn't necessarily the rest of this committee is not necessarily comfortable. Or speaking for myself, I have zero interest in putting this sewer line closer to a wetland, whether it is jurisdictionally mapped or not, and feel like we should kind of pull ourselves back from this conversation. And if there are other questions you have, Mr. Cox, about alternatives or whatnot, I think we can go that path.
Okay, let's go back to the alternative 2 then, which is the current design. And if you could bring up that map, that would be helpful. Yeah, that one there with the purple or lavender.
Do you want the clearing limits shown?
Yes. So it's not just the clearing limits, but it's also the new permanent easement is that we're really having, this is really the issue, is that we're having significant serious impacts on these property owners. And so if we were to go with this current design, what can we do to minimize these impacts? Now, and the reason I ask that is I've had some discussions with people who are in engineering fields, and they seem skeptical that we need to have such a high degree of impact for this size sewer line. And I guess because of that, I'm skeptical that we've done our due diligence to figure out ways to minimize the impacts. Because really, when we look at these 8 properties, 7 or 8 properties here, is that the impacts are quite extensive. They effectively are just eliminating their backyards from their use. And they can't build back there anything significant. They can't, they probably would be unlikely to be able to put an addition on their house. They wouldn't be able to build a garage back there if they wanted to, or any kind of accessory structure back there if they wanted to. So I guess the question in my mind is, what more can we do to minimize the impacts if we go with this design? For example, the construction easement, for example, if we were to use these devices that go into these trenches to hold up the walls, can we reduce the size of the easements necessary in order to go in there and do the construction?
Council member, I think at this point, the staff has done the best that they can in the engineering to date. Certainly, as real estate works with individual property owners on acquisitions, and we get into refinements, there's sometimes opportunities to address concerns that come up through that process. But I think from a broad engineering perspective, applying our standards, I think the staff has done everything they can to minimize the impact within our standards.
Okay. That's fine. That's the extent of my questions, but I would like to hear if there's anyone in the audience that would like to come and speak to this issue.
Actually, due to time, and we're already running a bit behind schedule, we're not going to take public input right now.
Okay.
I believe we've all received emails, multiple over many months, and have the information we need. We've been sitting with this one section of this sewer project, this one single sewer project among the many that our city approves all the time for quite some time. And I think it's imperative on us at this table to make a hard and impactful decision. But do you folks have other questions before a motion is made? Seeing none? So I do want to recognize the impacts that are being made on individuals along the sewer line. I know firsthand what it's like to lose trees on your property, what it's like to see what you feel like and what is environmental destruction on your property, also in our city. And one of the most challenging aspects of our job as council members is to balance the needs of our individual constituents with the needs of the city and with the needs of protecting our environment. And noting that, I'd like to make a motion in support of alternative 2, while recognizing these individual residents' sacrifice that they're making for the protection of our environment and clean water. And I'm looking for a second.
Second.
All right, motion and a second. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
All opposed?
No.
All right, thank you. So we will move on to the NCOD process report we have.
And Matt Klim from our planning department will be joining us.
All right, thank you. So I'll be talking about NCODs today. We'll talk about what NCODs are, what they regulate in the city, how they get made, where they are located, and we'll answer some questions that were directed to staff.
And I will clarify, we are not making any recommendations or asking for any action today.
Thank you. All right, so NCODs are an extra layer of zoning that are applied to neighborhoods throughout the city that are used to alter the base dimensional standards of the existing zoning. So all property in the city is zoned, and NCOD is an extra layer of zoning that changes the underlying zoning. NCODs are based on the built characteristics of an existing neighborhood, and they're typically more restrictive than the zoning of that neighborhood. So of course, zoning laws regulate all facets of development. NCODs are limited to a certain subset of standards that they can regulate, typically things that pertain to building height and placement on a piece of property and the size of pieces of property. And so how do NCODs get made? There are 4 main steps. Each of them relies on a council decision, and it generally takes about a year. The last few we've done have taken a year. So these are all processes that you participate in. This has happened over 20 times in the city. This is the list of all of the existing NCODs. Some of them have multiple components, like Cameron Park has 2 different areas, as does Mordecai. You'll see at the end of the list, there are 2 with asterisks. So the Willow Run South has not been, Willow Run has not been mapped, nor has West Idlewild. And this map shows their locations in the city. And so we were asked a question by Councilmember Stewart: what are NCOD's impact on housing affordability and housing options? And this is what we found in our study, and I'll walk through each of these for you. Generally speaking, NCODs decrease the permitted density. So 79% of the city's NCODs increase minimum lot size, and 42% increase minimum lot width. That means that properties in these NCODs are required to be larger. So a larger piece of property is dedicated to a single house, and that reduces permitted density. Houses in our NCODs are generally shorter and farther from the street. You can see how height and front setback is regulated here. NCODs don't preserve affordability in terms of tax value per acre. We looked at a term from 2009 to 2019. This graph, the green line you see, represents the change in tax value per acre for all residential zoning districts R1 through R10. And you'll see here, this bar represents all of the NCODs taken together, in line with the city average for tax value change per acre from 2009 to 2019. NCODs don't reduce permit activity. We looked at all the permits issued in the various NCODs, and actually the rate for permits in NCODs is higher than the rest of the city. You also see generally the relationship between how many units are encumbered with NCODs today and where they exist, and how many units are outside of NCODs, rather. And finally, NCODs don't regulate housing type. Housing type is generally based on the base zoning. So the existing zoning of a piece of property, absent an overlay, will regulate building type. And so your memo also outlines some qualitative follow-ups that we could initiate as staff under your direction. Otherwise, I can answer any questions for you.
That was super speedy. Do council members have questions? No questions? Come on now.
Thank you for this. This is obviously an interesting topic as we wade into issues of affordability and density and all of the things that we venture to answer both as a council, but I think as a community and as a city. And I think there's a lot of merit to having the conversation of what it means to have these tools in our toolbox. And I think that, this is helpful information and helpful data for us to ponder and think about. But glad that we don't have to make any decisions, because I think it's something that we really just, something that I at least want to think on and spend time talking about with community members and thinking about how we continue to utilize this tool kind of moving forward.
Any other questions or comments? So I want to say that I was, for those who are listening or watching or here in the audience, I was riveted by this presentation, or a little less than the presentation, but the backup is incredible. I think it's some great information that really helps us understand this tool a little bit better and how it mostly isn't really helping us reach our goals around affordability, but that it's not preventing us either from adding kind of a diverse housing stock. I don't know that we need a motion per se, but to report it out from committee is something I'm interested in doing.
It would be appropriate for a motion to send it back to the council. You can send it back with no recommended action, just for information of the council.
So I think we should move this out of committee back to council as a report out for more information for the rest of council to consider as we look at NCODs moving forward. My sense is that this is likely not a worthwhile tool moving forward that meets our goals, but that it's also more worth our council's time to explore the tools that will help us build an abundance of diverse housing options instead of refiguring NCODs in some way, shape, or form. So with that, I will take a motion to send it back out.
So moved. Can I get clarification on the motion?
Yeah.
I don't understand the motion. The motion, I move to take this memo and have it reported to council.
Mike.
I move to have this memo and report and presentation moved from committee and presented to council. That's it.
But with no recommendation or action?
Correct.
Correct.
Okay.
A second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? All right.
Thank you.
And then on to building height. And Travis Green, City Planning.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So this is a discussion topic that might seem very familiar, and it's because in December we presented a text change to the full City Council that was ultimately adopted, but there was a question about kind of the trajectory of the request, and there's a bit of history here, so we'll walk briefly through that and talk about how height is regulated in the city of Raleigh. So I'll start with a summary of existing regulations and then talk a bit about the recent text change history. So just as a reminder, height is regulated in our UDO both in measurement in feet and number of stories. So you've got an example here on the screen. What this is telling us is that a detached house in a residential zoning district is a maximum of 3 stories and a maximum of 40 feet. That's an and. That means both metrics here apply. And this is extremely typical in the residential zoning districts, 3 stories and 40 feet. By reference, townhouses can be up to 45 feet, apartments up to 50 feet, but you're still in that general range. So same is true in mixed-use zoning districts using number of stories and measurement of feet and height, but we treat it a little bit differently. So whereas the residential zoning district has an inherent height measurement tied to the building type, the mixed-use zoning districts use height districts. So beginning here in this chart, you see there's 3 through 40. It's not completely sequential, but these are the breakdowns for all of the different height districts, and they again correspond to different measurements of feet and height. There are other regulations that are in play here. I won't go into great detail with these, but there are regulations about the minimum first floor height, and you can see that set here. And these are set again by building type, and this is measured from the floor that you're standing on to the floor above you. That's a minimum measurement that's applied to every building, and it's applied by building type. So taking a step back and thinking about how we used to regulate height, the UDO changed this by introducing the new height regulations and new height districts. But in the previous zoning code, there was no predictability related to height. Buildings could be taller if the setback increased. So if you had a very large property, and this was true for even residential properties, single-family residential, if you had a very large property, you could build a very tall structure as long as you were far enough away from setback line. So what I've quoted here is language out of the previous code that said structures can be built to any height, provided you've got the setback to accommodate it. I'm paraphrasing. There were additional steps, however, for taller buildings. So once we got above 75 feet, there was a requirement to have approval by the Planning Commission, and then in some cases by the City Council for very tall buildings. And for that reason, building height was largely unpredictable. So if someone were to reach out to the city and say, how tall can my building be on this property? The answer was, it depends. Depends on how big your property is, depends on how far away you are from your property line, depends on whether or not you can gain approval by Planning Commission or City Council. So that brings me to the next slide. You know, why'd we change the regulations? And it was all about predictability, to have a more form-centric set of regulations in our code. That really was one of our main focal points of the UDO, was introducing those elements of form and making it predictable for the public at large and for property owners. So thinking back to how this whole topic started, there was a petition of citizens, and I'm going to breeze right through this because you just heard this about a month ago. Petition of citizens came before the City Council, asked for an analysis of the height districts in the code, and the Planning Commission was asked to take a look at the item. They formed a special subcommittee, and they took their time and did a fair amount of research. Staff reviewed peer cities, and we looked to other large cities, not only in the South, but across the country, to see how they dealt with height. We also took a look at modern high-rise techniques, construction techniques. We're blessed in that we've got a staff member that used to do this for a living in the real world and lended his expertise to us. And so the subcommittee ultimately took all of this feedback into account, looked at the research, and made a recommendation to the City Council. So again, here are all the steps that went through. I'm not going to read through each one of these dates point by point, but you can see there's a fair amount of history here, beginning in October of 2016, ultimately to November 2019, where we had a recommendation from the Planning Commission that was moved to the City Council. So I'm showing you two different, two different charts here. On the left-hand side is what came out of the Planning Commission subcommittee. So they really drew a breakpoint here at 7 stories and acknowledged that maybe we didn't get it quite right for 7-story buildings, and that the measurement of feet in height should be increased somewhat from 90 feet to 102 feet. And then above that, once you have the 12, 20, and 40-story buildings, the measurement of feet in height really is superfluous, because who can tell, how tall a 40-story building is? You can generally tell it's a 40-story building, not that it's 500 feet tall. So that was the subcommittee recommendation. Then Planning Commission received that recommendation and asked for further considerations. So I'd focus your attention here in the 4, 5, and 7 districts. They recommended an increase in the 4-story category, increasing by 4 feet, increasing the 5-story category by 5 feet, and then getting rid of the measurement of feet in height for 7 stories. Now, ultimately, what was adopted by the City Council is what you see here on the slide, and that green box denotes really the focus of our conversation today. So the text change that was known as TC 1319 was adopted, so that's in play now. But the council asked questions about 4 and 5, more specifically, looking into the Planning Commission recommendation and understanding if we got the regulation right or not. So, we've been asked this question a number of different times. How did we come up with all of these numbers here? Forget that we just made a text change. How did we come up with 90 feet? How did we come up with 500 feet? When we began this conversation back in 2016, I reached out to our consultants and asked them about that. We looked at the math, and you can do very simple math here and figure out that 50 feet divided by 3 is 16.6 repeating feet per story. It's an odd number. Same thing with 4-story. 62 divided by 4 is 15.5. 75 divided by 5, 15. So obviously there's irregularity here. And then once you get above that, it becomes a more regular pattern where every floor is going to be 12.5 feet in height. So I asked our consultants about that. Why is that? And didn't really have a good solid answer for us. Just said, well, that's the way it kind of played out. That's the way we did the math, and we wanted to use round numbers for the number of feet in height. So that's how it worked. So that's maybe a look under the hood, and that sometimes numbers in planning aren't exact. They're round. So from a next steps perspective, if we want to continue the conversation, staff is happy to do that. We can bring you back additional information, and we can really delve into any one of the height categories you'd like. Obviously, if a text change is our preferred path here, it would need to be authorized, and staff would have to be given direction as to what would need to change. And then third door to walk through is if we're happy with the way the code's written, we can just report this item out without any action. Happy to take any questions.
Council members have any questions?
I can make a comment.
Sure.
Because I was in the GNR committee when we discussed this previously, and when we talked about 3, 4, and 5-story buildings. Obviously, the taller the building, the bigger the building, the less energy efficient it is going to be. It's going to require more energy to heat and cool. Taller buildings will also, if they're close to residential areas, will impact residential areas with increased shadows, for example, and it will obscure the view from residential areas. So it has those impacts as well. And I personally felt that I like the idea of human-scaled structures. And I personally felt that, yes, we could standardize on height for 3, 4, and 5 stories at a lower level of 15 feet per story. So this 5-story building would be 75 feet, a 4-story building would be 60 feet, and a 3-story building would be 45 feet. So that's really what I would support. The notion of going taller bothers me because, as I believe staff reported in committee, is that we have far more 4- and 5-story buildings that are closer to residential areas than we do with the 7, 12, 20, and 40-story buildings. That was the primary reason why I agreed to removing the foot cap on 7, 12, and 20 and 40-story buildings, was because once you get above 5 stories, you're going from wood construction to steel and concrete construction. And one, you're going to be constrained by the economics of building a tall building such as that. But the other thing is that those buildings are going to be far away from, in generally, in Raleigh anyway, from residential areas. So, so those are my reasons for not wanting to increase 4 and 5 beyond what they are currently at, 62 and 75 feet. But my real preference would be to actually lower the 3-story buildings to 45, the 4-story to 60, and keep the 5-story at 75 feet, and they would all be standardized on 15 feet per story.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? So my understanding is that there is a possible text change that we can move forward that would move 4 stories from 62 feet to 68 feet and 5 stories from 75 to 80 feet. In my 5'4" world, it's hard for me to comprehend that 75 to 80 feet would feel like I would feel it at all, even if I was right underneath it. So I'd like to make a motion that we move this text change, or ask staff to move forward with. I'm getting there. Staff to
I think
move.
you're asking to authorize the text change.
And look at that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I would like to ask staff to authorize a text change, noting that there will be points along the way for public comment and whatnot.
Just to clarify, I think the motion is to recommend that the council authorize a text change.
For the
Yes.
4-story building, 68 feet, 5-story building, 80 feet? Is that what we're looking at?
Yes. Thank you. Thank
I
you.
second that motion.
Right, there is a motion and a second. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
No.
All right, thank you. And with that, it is 4:53, and we will adjourn.